Hello class. Today we are talking about project design. And of course we're talking about design with respect to ecosystem restoration. But the steps you'll take to conceptualize and inform a design you can apply to lots of different kinds of projects. So here we go. Let's just review briefly what we've been doing lately. So we talked about site visits and the SWOT-C process and risk assessment so you can really understand all the potential um, opportunities and risks associated with a particular location. That process, the process of visiting a site over and over and interviewing the stakeholders and over and um, systematically addressing each element of the project through the SWOT-C wheel informs the project requirements. So those are the things that absolutely have to happen to meet your goals and objectives. All of that then informs the project scoping document. Again, that's a packet of information that will prove very useful when it's time to take next steps towards implementation. So the scoping document, really everything you've done in the project development phase to this point informs your initial designs, and that's where we're going today. So here's a little chart of the workflow, and it's good to keep revisiting this over time as we learn about each step along the way. Of course, you start with your mission and goals. You initiate the project, bringing people together around a table or together around a site. You daydream about what's possible there. Again, that's called the light build model. Once you have an idea of the stakeholders' objectives and what you think is feasible on the site, then you formally develop your preliminary goals and objectives. You get out there and you do your site analysis. So you get things on paper. You go through the SWOT-C process, as I mentioned. You double back if you identify any risks or threats that need to be addressed first before going further. You refine your goals and objectives to build those project requirements. You make sure you do your risk assessment and your scope. And again, all of this is leading toward the design. One of the key considerations, and I've mentioned this briefly before, but one of the key considerations in designing a project is a reference site. So reference sites are important in a number of ways. If you're trying to do a before-after control kind of experiment, your reference site would be your control. But it's also helpful to have a reference site handy in the sense that you can develop a database. This database can include all the vegetation present in a well-functioning ecosystem so that you have a target for what species assemblages you want to bring into the restoration site. It could also contain information about habitat features, species densities, not just species lists, species age structure, the length of the edge of the site. I mean, it really could encapsulate a whole lot of information about the ecosystem. It just depends on what you have time for and what your objectives are. One thing that is important when considering establishing reference site monitoring is really understanding the history of the site and whether or not it's really pristine. You do not want to tie your project to a site that you think is in fairly good order and has no history of manipulation. You don't want to tie a project to a site that it turns out isn't functioning as a holistic ecosystem, because then you're tying your project to unnatural objectives or years that are just blips. So for example, maybe you've observed a site near your restoration area and you happen to observe it on a year where there's a ton of snow or a ton of water, and you think, great, that's the hydrology that we want to mimic, but it just happens to be a really wet year. Um, and you come back the next year and the reference site is bone dry, that it's actually an ephemeral stream, not a year-round stream. So that's just an example of needing to really survey the local community about the place, looking for data that already exists, or watching a site over a number of years to make sure that you understand how it functions. You do want to look at a number of locations if possible, but the world is finite. There are very few places that haven't been manipulated by people, and I'll give you an example here. This is 100 miles of the Columbia River. This is the bulk, although not the entirety, of the Columbia River estuary. So this is the part of the lower river that is influenced by tides and by salt intrusion. Salt reaches from the Columbia River bar, a couple dozen miles up to about here, but the tides continue to play a role much, much further. In fact, all the way up to Bonneville Dam, with a diminishing effect the further you go. In any case, it's a huge place, very dynamic, very economically and commercially important, in addition to providing a lot of wildlife habitat. Despite all that, despite these huge wildlife refuge islands here, when you really look around, there is almost nothing that hasn't been diked and leveed and plumbed and tide gated and manipulated for the benefit of flood control or agriculture. And the case study that we've been returning to over and over, South Slough, is on the Lewis and Clark River, which is an embayment which is in Youngs Bay, or feeds into Youngs Bay, and an embayment right near Astoria. And so the restoration project was roughly here, and we wanted to find a reference site, or something close to a reference site, in that vicinity. Or really anywhere in this stretch of the estuary. Well, it turns out that the only wetland / spruce swamp that we could find that hadn't been manipulated was on the Youngs River, another river feeding into Youngs Bay, and it's right here, Cooperage Slough. So we had to search the entire estuary and then zoom in on our area of interest, and then get out there in boats and get out there in hip waders and slog around and try to find something that hadn't historically been modified. And it turns out we found a place that was about 30 acres. There were no records on it, so we couldn't be totally certain that it hadn't been modified in the past. But there wasn't very strong evidence on the ground for the kind of features that we were trying to remove, like dikes and levees and tide gates. And when we did some fish surveys and some plant surveys and some tidal channel surveys, it looked pretty good. It looked, to the best of our knowledge, it hadn't been altered. And so we initiated several years of data collection at Cooperage Slough to serve as that database that would inform really all of our restoration projects for the next 10 or 15 years. So it was a lot of work, but a very worthwhile effort, because it became the poster child for what's achievable with these tidal restoration projects in the lower estuary. But again, the point here is that it's quite difficult to find that environment, but it's a very important step to take. Okay, so there are a number of philosophies about how to design restoration, and you may have encountered some of these before. Let's go through them. Historical reconstruction is a very common objective, but very, very rarely actually achieved successfully. And let's talk about why. So South Slough is an example of an attempt at historical reconstruction, where the park felt very strongly that they wanted to rehabilitate the land such that it would look and function like the wetlands that Lewis and Clark camped next to, and the wetlands they utilized as part of their epic historic journey. Um, so, they had a defined mandate and a defined target for that project. What this requires, if you're going to try to reproduce something from the past, it requires an adequate description. So in this case, the park had a good database of all the diaries, maps, drawings, sketches, journals, oral histories of the area, everything they could find with respect to the Lewis and Clark expedition. Now, historic reconstruction is very rarely feasible for a couple of reasons. A, very often that kind of information is not available. I mean, Lewis and Clark are famous, and that journey was well documented and well mapped. So this is an example, a rare example of where you have that information at your fingertips. Most of the time, you're lucky if you can find aerial photos from, the 1950s to inform what used to happen at a site. The other reason that historical reconstruction is problematic is that the world is changing fast. So with growing populations, growing human populations, with climate change, with all kinds of pressures put on the landscape that were not there historically or are occurring much faster now, it may not be possible to have a pristine historical wetland, for example. You may just not have the water you used to have. You may not have the species you used to have, or you may not be able to maintain them over time. So a restoration project can do a beautiful job of, for a few years, establishing something that looks very historic. But with the advent of invasive species, for example, it from all parts of the world, it may not be possible with your constraints around budget and time to keep that project in pristine condition, because ecosystems change, and ecosystems are more prone to change now with all the pressures that we apply to the landscape. So again, it's really unusual to achieve a historical reconstruction and keep it that way. And in fact, it might be misguided as a philosophy. So keep that in mind as we talk about some of these other philosophies around project design. So remnant patches. This is a pretty common technique, and it's certainly employed here around the University of Idaho with respect to the Palouse. So with Palouse Prairie, most of it's gone, right? So the prairie has been more or less eradicated and replaced with agriculture. Fields of lentils and wheat, immense agricultural systems. And the prairie that once was there, the wildflowers and the grasses and the animal species dependent on them, have been constrained and reduced to the steep slopes of some of the buttes that rise up out of the grassland that's been converted to agriculture. Really, these are just the slopes that don't have the soil or the aspect or the slope that farmers could work with. So we're talking about tiny patches of remnant prairie. What you do in this kind of design is you survey everything that's left. Maybe you build a GIS database with locations of remnant patches of prairie and characteristics of the prairie at each of those locations. You survey a large area, you inventory the remnants, and then you begin to work on expanding what you have or connecting what you have. So hopefully, if you're a conservation entity, you find ways to tie some of these patches together so they, at least the plants and animals, have corridors with which to spread their population. It is a challenging type of restoration, but it's more and more common because we have really fragmented the landscape. So whether you're talking about forests or prairie or wetlands, you name it, no matter what the kind of ecosystem, we have done a thorough job of fragmenting those landscapes. And that's why we're seeing so many threatened and endangered species now. One of the reasons we're seeing so many listed species because of that fragmentation, excuse me. So this might be the type of project that you end up working on as a project manager. And the scale of the individual projects may be small, but the cumulative impact of restoring the landscape bit by bit by bit can have a meaningful effect. Okay, probably the most common design approach these days is fabrication. And another way to say that is habitat creation. And that's typically how I use the term most frequently. It's a very common approach, like I said, and particularly with respect to wetlands. So the no wetland loss policies that many states and federal entities have instituted require mitigation, compensatory mitigation, as part of permitting a new development. So let's say you're a contractor or a developer building a new housing subdivision. And you know that your infrastructure, your homes, your streets, your pipes, etc., are going to eradicate a few acres of wetland that exists out there. Well, the powers that be are not going to let you do that without some compensatory mitigation, meaning you're going to have to either restore wetland nearby or create wetland nearby. And there's all kind of examples of businesses and even the government agencies finding ways to get around this, but on balance, this is a pretty solid, oops, we lost our slide. This is a pretty solid approach that developers just build into their budget. It's not restoration. Very often it's creation. So it's problematic in the sense that wetlands and many other types of habitats are very subtle. It's easier to restore a habitat than it is to create one from scratch. You may not be able to achieve as high a quality a habitat when you're starting from scratch and trying to install a wetland, for example, somewhere where historically there was no wetland. You have to key in the elevations just right. You have to change the landform itself just right. And very often that's not achieved with 100% success. Here's a good example. I used to live and teach in Florida, and housing development there is incredibly aggressive. What we have here on the upper left, this is an aerial of the county I lived in. This is what the landscape looks like without human intervention. It's swamp, so flooded forest, with lots and lots of depressional lakes. And there's a ton of water moving across the landscape. Seasonally, it dries out and there's fire and then it floods again. So it's a very dynamic landscape even though it's so flat. But most of this has now been replaced with this. So we have lots and lots and lots of gated communities being installed across these floodplains. And the way they deal with all the flood water is they dig these deep lakes. And it has a couple of benefits. It gives the water somewhere to go, and it protects the homes that they build from flooding. It also gives the residents of those communities something pretty to look at, albeit a very artificial lake that has to be maintained in perpetuity. And that's where we get to the compensatory mitigation problem. So the state is allowing these lakes to substitute for the natural lakes that were destroyed. And in reality, the lakes in these subdivisions are anything but natural. Um, they have to be aerated constantly, so there's pumps that are moving that water around so it doesn't stagnate. Even then, the temperatures build up excessively, and you get explosions of weeds and algae. And then you have to pay people to go around and spray herbicide in the water so that the water doesn't become irreparably choked with weeds. So it's an incredibly chemically intensive process, a very financially intensive process, and it is no substitute for natural habitat. I mean, these lakes attract wildlife, especially things like river otters and osprey, but they don't have nearly the biodiversity that the natural ecosystem had. So this is an example, kind of an extreme example of how the no net loss policy, while its intentions are good, depending on which agency is interpreting it and which state you're looking at, it may not be implemented appropriately. So that was habitat creation, and that's super common. If you start paying attention in your community where you live, you'll start seeing this, where perhaps there's ponds or parks that have been created to offset the impacts of a development, but they're really not natural habitat. Okay, so those are some of the different philosophies. We had historic reconstruction, we had remnant patch, we had habitat creation or fabrication. I'm more a proponent of just restoration that's informed by good science. So we don't have to create the perfect, pristine historic habitat, but we want to make a habitat that's resilient enough to deal with all of the coming changes, whether it's sea level rise or intensive fires. We want to try to make habitat that won't be wiped out by future events and that will continue to serve the community well. And that does take good input from ecologists and physical scientists, etc. So, how do we actually go about making the conceptual design? And remember that when you design something, you're going to revise those designs again and again and again. So we're just talking right now about the conceptual design, the very first attempt at sketching out the project according to the project requirements that you developed earlier on. So some of the things that feed into it are the construction elements, obviously, the things you want to change on the ground. Other things that feed into your conceptual design are those management strategies. So if you're changing how a particular species is managed on the landscape, that's important to build into the conceptual design. You know, your conceptual design is crucial because it's going to initiate the project implementation and produce ultimately construction specs that your contractor can work with. And it's also going to inform your grant applications, your permit applications, everything that you communicate to the world about the project comes back to your conceptual design that you and your stakeholders develop. So this is a really important step. You'll recall that when you got out on the site and you did your SWOT-C analysis, that I mentioned one thing that you have to get comfortable with is sketching the project. And maybe you have good photos and good maps, but it's still a very important skill. And here's why. You're probably going to hire a consultant to build a very pretty, professional, conceptual design, but early on, you want to be able to communicate to that consultant your desires as a project manager. So what you do is you take that sketch of that you produced during your site visits and you just clean it up a bit. So maybe you had a sketch that had, power lines, road, uh, weedy patch, good habitat to preserve, everything that you observed on the site. Well, what you do next is you produce one of these bubble shape treatment maps. So this is your first attempt to inform the activities that you'll take during restoration. So if you look, this is a pretty good example where there are different bubbles for different types of treatment. So here we have native grassland with the little hatch marks representing grass. So you draw a bubble around the approximate area in which you want to establish native grassland. Here we have buffer planting, probably a hedgerow or something like that, that prevents disturbance of the restoration area. So that obviously is going to be planted along the roadside. And as another example, this dashed line represents existing vegetation you don't want it to disturb. So there are a few patches where you want to keep the bulldozers out. So you'll probably go out and fence these areas once you have a good surveyor on site. So you get the idea. What you're doing is putting bubbles around the approximation of treatment areas, and you're coding it such that your consultant, your GIS expert, whoever's going to produce the conceptual design has something to work with, has something to get them started. Now this type of bubble map can then be worked up in CAD or ArcGIS or QGIS or whatever program you use to create maps. Okay, so let's imagine that you have transitioned that bubble sketch into a professional mock-up of the restoration plan. It's important now to revisit the WBS structure, your goals and objectives, your actions, etc., to make sure that the design that was built by your consultant or in-house GIS person accomplishes everything you wanted to do when you set out those goals and objectives and actions. So you take a little time out and you do one of these restoration plan evaluation matrices. So let me show you how this is set up. So up here we have goals and objectives, and you can see with the case study that the book presents, they have 4 goals and objectives. Create southern willow scrub, protect park features, protect native vegetation, and improve ecological functions. Pretty straightforward. Beneath that, you get more specific and you get into the project requirements associated with each of these goals and objectives. So if we look at the create willow scrub, these are the things that absolutely need to happen. These are the requirements to meet that objective. Remove non-native species. Create 3 acres of habitat with willows. Protect those plantings from herbivory, etc., etc., etc. Okay, so this was what came out of your project development phase. But now someone has produced a pretty design, and you want to double check that design to make sure that it accomplishes all of these project requirements. So what you do is you take the design, the map, and you dissect it for all of its elements. So if you look at the map, you might see, okay, they've got a clearing plan, they've got a planting plan, they have noted sensitive areas that you don't want to disturb, they are locating areas where they can control human access, etc., etc. And then what you do is you fill in the boxes where each of these restoration plan elements intersects with a project requirement. So for example, remove non-native species. Where is that addressed in the restoration plan map? Well, the clearing plan addresses it, the planting plan addresses it, and the individual non-native removed part of the plan addresses it. And a restoration plan, I should say, is not just a map, but it's materials that come with the map that describe everything you're going to do. So maybe it's a packet of information that a consultant gives back to you. And what you're doing here as a project manager is QA/QC. You're checking that what that consultant produced meets all your project requirements that you set out with the stakeholder, with the landowner. So in this case, sure enough, project requirement number 1 under goal and objective number 1 has been met by these parts of the consultant's product that they provided you. And maybe it's not a consultant, maybe it's one of your team, but that's okay. Either way, you need to double check it, because again, that's your responsibility. You're responsible as a project manager for the quality of the project deliverables. So you go through this and you look at all those intersections, and then afterwards you look for gaps. So here and here, and these 2 columns here, and one more, those are not met. The restoration plan did not address those particular project requirements. So for example, in this case, the project plan did not address the need to begin planting on October 15th. That could have something to do with precipitation and the best time of year to plant, but the plans did not make it self-evident that it's very important you start at a certain time. So what you'll do is you ask your team member or your consultant to go back and revise the restoration plan such that it does address all of these gaps. And you make sure it's complete before you move on to project implementation, before you seek funding, before you seek permits. So this is one of those stages where quality control is very important. So big picture, there are a lot of things that feed into the design process. Obviously, stakeholder expectations and your expectations, because you've been there from the beginning. The design approach. So what philosophy are you following? Are you trying to reproduce historic habitat, or are you trying to make something new? Resources, of course. You have to build a design that's realistic according to the resources you have available or expect will be available. Site factors, obviously, everything you learn from your site visits and your SWOT-C analysis are going to inform the design. Maintenance and monitoring long-term commitments, that's super important, because you do not want to build a project that's not going to sustain itself naturally. It's very rare that you expect to have funding to do heavy, intensive maintenance of the site indefinitely. So maintenance and aftercare, things we're going to talk about later in the course, the things that come after project implementation, that you still want to anticipate how that's going to inform the design. Permit and agreement conditions. So, you're not going to design something that doesn't meet local and state and federal standards. Especially if it involves infrastructure, you need to make sure that your conceptual design addresses that. So, for example, if you have power lines that run through your area, you may need to protect those. You may need to build up some flood control around those power lines so that whatever you're doing on site has no impact on the community's energy system. And then finally, double check that your goals and objectives are embedded in the design, and that's why we did this here. All right, so what does your design include? I mean, your bubble map was a good start, but these are some of the types of design elements that are commonly worked on. Maybe not necessarily by you, maybe you've brought together a team of experts to address each of these design elements. Then again, maybe you're a project manager that has a specific area of expertise and you are personally responsible for producing some of these design elements. That will just depend on your education and who you end up working for. Okay, so a lot of my work has to do with hydrology. So the design elements do need to assess and address hydrology in most cases. For example, if you're going to do any hydrologic modification on site, you might need to contract a hydrologist to do some modeling to understand where water is, where it goes under different conditions, maybe seasonally or under extreme events like hurricanes. In any case, you want to understand how water impacts and interacts with the site. And this might involve some pretty intense computer modeling or specialized software or just specialized expertise that you don't have in-house that you need to contract out. When I say hydrologic modification, I'm very often referring to wetlands, stream restorations, tidal reconnections, riparian restoration, vernal pool creation, on and on. There's lots of different kinds of water resource restoration, but point is, you're probably going to need to involve someone with hydrologic expertise to do some modeling. That way you're kind of covering your liability if your project, for example, is linked to some kind of flood in a few years and the locals blame the restoration site. This is all going to impact your bottom line as an organization and also your reputation. So the best thing you can do at this stage is do some modeling to make sure that your restoration doesn't have any negative effects to the neighboring landowners or folks downstream. We've definitely seen that happen, and it's a hard thing to watch when a really good project is implemented. It looks to be achieving everything it was set out to achieve, but then the hydrology does something unexpected, and it comes back to haunt that organization. Okay, another really important thing to be thinking about is landform modification, and this will also be included in your design package. So in this case, it's really just what you're doing with a bulldozer or a backhoe or equipment like that. What are you doing to reshape the land, to recontour slopes, to adjust the aspect or shape or micro relief of the site? Pretty obvious. That landform modification feeds directly into this design element. Most projects have to address vegetation. You may be introducing or reintroducing native species, but you may also be working on more complicated goals like vegetation zones, edge habitat, etc. You know, very rarely are you just trying to bring one species into or back into a site, but you're trying to bring a community of species back into a site. And you cannot do so without making sure that the landform is appropriate to that community of species, that you've dealt with the type of slope, aspect, etc. that those plant communities need, and that you've dealt with their soil requirements, you've dealt with the seed bank, and then importantly, you've also dealt with the presence or potential presence of invasive species. These days, it's incredibly unlikely that you're going to eradicate or completely eliminate invasive species. They will find their way back in no matter what you do. But what you want to do is give those native communities a massive head start. You want to make sure they establish themselves so robustly that when the invasives arrive again, the non-native plant species or animal species, that the ecosystem is healthy enough that it can sustain itself, that it doesn't immediately turn it back into a weed patch. There are, of course, other design elements when it comes to ecosystem restoration. You know, very often habitats need things besides vegetation. They need rocks, they need boulders, they need special soils, they need nest boxes or snags for um, breeding birds. They need woody debris in the streams to provide habitat for fish, any number of things. So this will be indicated on your restoration designs and in the descriptions, the written descriptions of those maps. And they are specifically linked to ecosystem functions. So you don't just put these things out there because they're pretty, but because they help with wildlife rearing, wildlife refuge, wildlife forage, etc. So you're linking it to some ecosystem function and need. Okay, good. So we are going to revisit South Slough one last time. So far, you have developed some goals and objectives. You've developed some stakeholder interview questions. You've gone through the SWOT-C wheel on this project. And I know it's challenging because you've not been out there, but it's a worthwhile endeavor just to intellectually think these things through, and then hopefully you'll get some practice on the ground later. But today what we're going to do is we're going to create a conceptual design sketch. So a bubble map. You are going to sketch this site and everything you think is important to address in the coming restoration. Now I should say that this site has already been restored, and I'll show you what they achieved in a moment. But as a thought exercise and as a skill building exercise, we're going to have you sketch this out and turn it in. So let me just remind you of some of the important things that we would have encountered had we been out on site doing our SWOT-C analysis. So we've been over it before, but it's worth reminding. So again, there is a road here that essentially acts as a levee, preventing tidal river water from flooding this historic wetland. There is a tide gate here that lets water out, but won't let water in. So it essentially helps the farmers and grazers drain water from the site. There were other things installed to expedite that process. So drainage ditches, lots of them. You can't see them all, but they're all over the place. There's a drainage ditch at the bottom of this forested hill slope. There's drainage ditches running north to south up here. And then we have the remnant of a stream. So this stream does come from upslope. It does contain good cutthroat habitat, for example. But it's not accessible, obviously, to salmonids and other fish species. What you have artificially is a warm water slough with things like bass and sunfish, non-native fish in there, which is indicative of an unhealthy ecosystem. You can see, if you look carefully, you can see remnant oxbows, remnant branches of tidal channels. Tidal channels are incredibly sinewy. They snake out in all directions because, of course, the tide is a very, very powerful force. And it carves its way into low elevation sites in all kinds of directions. And so at one time, probably, this was a branching tree of all kind of tidal channels. But it was simplified and straightened and ditched and cut off from the river in an effort to create agricultural fields. And finally, remember that this area had dredge spoil piled up, so they pulled mud out of the river and piled it up in this portion of the site so that they could keep it a little more high and dry than the rest of the farm. So you developed some goals and objectives. You thought about the problem and you thought about what you'd like to achieve there. At this point, knowing the site better, you need to develop one of those bubble maps. So use your judgment, your expertise to this point to sketch out the site, and then build in some treatment bubbles for what you'd like to achieve there. I'm not expecting artistic excellence, but what I'm expecting is to see something similar to this. Okay, so you build in the features that exist, and then you build in the treatments you would like to do. And those treatments could involve re-excavating some of those historic tidal channels. It could involve dealing with the tide gate and installing something that allows better flow of water onto the site. It could involve all kind of plantings to reestablish native species. It could involve some of those habitat structures that we talked about. I'll leave it up to you, but you're going to do your best at that. So at this point, I want you to pause and work on that while it's fresh in your mind. And we'll provide further instructions, of course. But I'll briefly show you, just so you can, if you have any uncertainty about what to produce, this picture here shows what was actually accomplished. So have a look. I won't tell you too much, but you'll see immediately some of the changes. So again, the tide gate was here, and now you have full flow. So something was done here to address the roadway. That's probably the #1 thing you need to get on your conceptual design. And then obviously the once simplified habitat, here's the stream that runs up into the woods, and there's its little watershed. The once simplified stream has been made more complex, and a number of things were done here to make that happen. Obviously, tidal channels were reconstructed, ditches were dealt with, plantings, etc. And I can tell you that it's a very successful project, and it's very satisfying to go back and look at it now. So do your best to take what you know about this and build a conceptual design that doesn't absolutely have to mimic this, but goes that direction. So you want to move from here to here by providing us some ideas visually that we can then take to folks who are going to implement the project. Okay, that's it for today. Thank you for your attention. I look forward to seeing your sketches and the results of your work this week. We'll talk soon. Take care.